Few names in the history of the Old Republic carry as much weight as Darth Revan, or left behind a legacy that kept reshaping the galaxy for thousands of years after his death. Drawing from core legend sources, including the novel The Old Republic, Revan, the Knights of the Old Republic game, the Darth Bane trilogy, and the novel The Old Republic Annihilation, this documentary covers his complete story from the first choice that set the galaxy on a different course to the centuries of consequences that followed it. He was a Jedi who chose to act when the Order refused to move, a general who won the most important war of his era and lost himself in the process, and a figure so dangerous and so necessary that the galaxy still felt his shadow thousands of years after his name was forgotten by most who carried on inside it. He has been called 5 things across his lifetime: hero, traitor, conqueror, villain, and savior. Every one of those names was earned. And this is the story of how. Chapter 1. The Defiant Jedi. The Jedi High Council refused to go to war against the Mandalorians. Revan decided that was not an answer he could accept. The Old Republic, in the centuries before the war against the Mandalorians, was one of the oldest governing powers in galactic history. It had survived major conflicts with the Sith, long periods of rebuilding, and stretches of hard-won peace. The Jedi Order served at the center of that peace, acting as protectors, diplomats, and when the situation demanded it, soldiers. In the years before the war that would define Revan's generation, the Order spent most of its time in the first 2 roles. The Jedi High Council made its decisions carefully and slowly, weighing long-term effects against short-term pressures, because that care had come from hard experience. Wars had a way of lasting longer than the reasons that started them, and the Council had seen enough of those wars to know that rushing into battle created suffering that could carry on for generations. He grew up inside that tradition. The novel describes him as a powerful Jedi Master who rose quickly through the ranks of the Order. Not a slow learner or a careful climber, but the kind of student and then the kind of knight who stood out to those around him naturally. His mind moved fast. His connection to the Force was strong. He understood military planning in a way that most Jedi never had reason to develop, and he thought about the Order's role in the galaxy with a directness that some found impressive and others found troubling. His physical appearance was ordinary in every way. The same novel describes him as an ordinary-looking man with sharp features, pale skin, and shoulder-length black hair. Not the kind of presence that filled a room simply by entering it. What made him stand out was the quality of his thinking and the strength of his beliefs, not anything visible on the surface. His view on emotion was the clearest point of difference between him and the traditional Jedi teaching. The Order believed that strong emotions, especially attachment, were a source of danger. Feeling too deeply for another person could cloud a Jedi's judgment, and love could pull a warrior towards choices that serve personal feelings rather than the greater good. The traditional teaching pushed Jedi to find inner peace by moving past the grip of those emotions, to reach a state of calm that the Council believed produced better and more responsible decisions. He did not reject the idea of self-control entirely, and he accepted that unchecked emotion could cause real harm. But the book makes it clear that he viewed the traditional teaching as a mistake in its most extreme form. Pushing emotion down entirely, treating love and loyalty as weaknesses to be managed and suppressed, was, in his view, a foolish approach that weakened rather than strengthened a Jedi. He believed that positive emotions, love, the desire to protect those you cared about, loyalty to people worth being loyal to, could actually strengthen a Jedi's connection to the Force. They were not threats to be contained, they were sources of strength when understood and used correctly. That position did not win him many arguments in council chambers, but it was one he held without wavering, and it would shape every major choice he made for the rest of his life. Alongside him through this early period was Malak, his closest companion in the Order and, by any reasonable measure, his best friend. Malak was also a capable Jedi Knight, also growing frustrated with the Council's careful approach to the problems spreading across the galaxy, and also watching the same crisis unfold in the far outer territories with growing alarm. The two of them shared not just a philosophy, but a way of looking at the Order's purpose. that being a Jedi meant active protection rather than careful observation, and that there were moments when waiting for the right conditions was itself a kind of failure. The Mandalorian threat was one of those moments. The Mandalorians had been part of galactic history long before he was born, a warrior culture built around clans, guided by codes of combat and honor, and defined by their willingness to fight anyone who offered a real challenge. Under normal conditions, they raided, they challenged, and they occasionally negotiated. In the years before the war against them, however, something shifted in how they operated. Their attacks became more organized, more purposeful, and more deeply damaging to the systems they targeted. The far outer territories, never the most well-defended part of the Republic, began to fall sector by sector. Populations were driven from their homes. Republic forces, spread across an enormous area with too few soldiers, could not respond fast enough to protect the people being targeted. Requests for Jedi involvement reached Coruscant regularly, and the Council received them, considered them, and declined to act. The reasons were not fully public. Some members believed the conflict was pulling attention away from a deeper darkness they sensed growing at the edges of the Force. Some held to the principle that large-scale Jedi involvement in military campaigns had historically led to results worse than the conflicts they were meant to stop. Some may have believed, with hindsight wrongly, that the Mandalorian advance would slow on its own before reaching the Republic's core systems. Whatever their individual reasons, the result was the same. The outer territories suffered while the Order watched from a distance, and entire systems fell while the Council deliberated. For Revan, that distance was something he cannot accept and could not make peace with. He understood the Council's arguments and was not dismissive of the traditions he had grown up inside or the hard-earned wisdom those traditions contained. But he looked at the evidence in front of him and reached a different conclusion. The Jedi Order existed to protect people. They had the ability to act. Choosing not to use that ability in the face of a documented and growing threat was not caution. It was stepping away from the Order's most basic purpose. He made his case through proper channels, requested meetings, and brought the information coming out of the outer territories to the Council's attention repeatedly, asking them to reconsider their position. The Council held its position each time. At some point, he stopped asking and started organizing. He and his oldest companion began reaching out to other Jedi, those who shared the view that staying out of the fight while whole systems burned was impossible to defend. This was not a quick or simple process. The Council had authority and tradition on its side, and many Jedi trusted the Council's judgment because that Council had guided the Order through hard times before. He had to make the case not just that he was right, but that the Council was wrong, and that acting without their approval was the right and necessary thing to do. He was persuasive in a way that few people ever manage. Not simply presenting facts, but giving people a genuine reason to move. He offered a clear picture of what was happening, what it would continue to cost if nothing changed, and why the traditional arguments for staying back were failing the people the Order was supposed to protect. He made the case that there are times when an organization's own care for its principles causes harm by applying them too rigidly, and that this was one of those times. Some Jedi refused to hear it, others were convinced. Enough were moved to make a real difference. Among those who joined them was Mitra Surik, who would later become known as the Exile. As detailed in the book, it identifies her as one of his most trusted generals, a Jedi with strong personal instincts and the ability to run complex operations under pressure. Her presence was not symbolic or ceremonial. She handled responsibilities that would have stretched any standard military officer to their limits, and she became essential to how the campaign operated at every level. The Republic's response to his decision mixed relief with deep unease. The military had been struggling. The Mandalorian advances were not slowing, and there was no sign that they would stop at the outer territories. The arrival of Jedi-led forces, organized and directed in ways that conventional Republican units were not built to replicate, changed the shape of the campaign almost immediately. Revan did not show up to support the Republic's existing approach to the problem. He replaced it with his own, and he had the results to justify that move within a short period. His early victories were real, visible, and undeniable. The Jedi who followed him trusted his decisions in the field. Republic soldiers who served alongside him respected his leadership, and the Mandalorians, who had come to expect a certain level of disorder in the Republic's response, found themselves facing something different, an opponent who studied them, anticipated their movements, and refused to be easy to read or predict. That discipline, the refusal to treat a dangerous enemy as simply violent and disorganized, was one of his greatest strengths as a leader. He learned the Mandalorian culture, their codes of honor, their expectations in battle, and the cultural rules that shaped how they made decisions on and off the battlefield. He understood that to defeat them at a strategic level, he had to think the way they thought, and then find where that thinking broke down under pressure. That approach produced results, but it also required him to make decisions that went beyond ordinary and military planning. The Mandalorians fought to win without limits, and matching them meant being willing to operate the same way. This was where the war began to cost him something beyond lives and resources. The Jedi tradition asked its followers to weigh every action against its wider effects, to seek peace where possible, and to choose mercy where the situation allowed. He had not abandoned those values when he left Coruscant, but the campaign tested them constantly. There were situations where the choice that would protect the most people in the short term was not the choice those values would have recommended, and he made those decisions and accepted the cost, telling himself each time that he had to. The war spread, and he spread with it. The conflict consumed years. The Outer Territories, which had been the starting point, were only the beginning. The Mandalorians adjusted to his tactics, rebuilt where they took losses, and pushed in directions he had to scramble to address. The scope of the conflict expanded around him, and he took on the full role of top military commander of the Republic's combined forces. Not simply the leader of a Jedi detachment, but the person responsible for everything. He was not yet what history would call a Sith Lord. He was a Jedi who had made a choice and was living with the growing weight of it. But the man who entered the war against the Mandalorians, believing in decisive action and the duty to protect, was being changed by the experience of carrying that belief out at an enormous and unforgiving scale. War changes the people who fight it, and it changes the people who lead it most of all. The Council had been placed in a position it had not chosen by a man it cannot easily call back. The tension between the young commander and the Order's leadership did not resolve during the war. It simply sat unaddressed, while more immediate problems demanded everyone's attention. The Jedi who stayed behind watched what was unfolding in the Outer Territories and felt the darkness growing rather than shrinking. Something at the edges of the conflict that was wrong in ways that went beyond standard military aggression. The Force itself seemed to push back against what was happening, and whether that was a warning about the Mandalorians or about something else entirely was not yet clear. Revan, in the field and focused on winning, was not in a position to examine that feeling carefully. He had a war to finish, and he had a plan to do exactly that. What that plan would cost, and what he would find at the war's end, were things he could not yet see. He won the war against the Mandalorians, but what he found at its end would change him forever. Chapter 2: The Mandalorian Wars. The Mandalorian advance did not stop on its own, but Revan stopped it. By the time he had taken full control of the Republic's forces, the war had already burned through enough years and lives to define a generation. The far outer territories were scarred. Systems that had been working and populated before the conflict were barely holding together, and the Republic's military, while still functioning, was showing the strain of a long campaign against a disciplined enemy that did not fight the way conventional Republic tactics were built to handle. He had not simply slowed the Mandalorian advance, he had changed the nature of the fight entirely. The storyline makes clear that he was a brilliant military leader, a commander whose decisions repeatedly caught his opponents off balance, and whose understanding of both Force abilities and standard military planning gave him options that the Republic officers without Force training could not match. But brilliance in war is not a clean quality. It requires making choices that protect lives in one place by spending them in another, requires using tools that leave lasting damage behind, and requires accepting that winning is a process built piece by piece rather than a single decisive moment. He built victories, and alongside them, he built costs. The Mandalorians were not a simple enemy. Their culture was built on the idea that combat was honorable, that the strongest earned their position through battle, and that defeat against a worthy opponent was not shameful as long as the fight was real and fully committed. They respected power, they respected skill. What they had not encountered in this conflict was an opponent who combined Force abilities with the kind of strategic depth that the Republic's new top commander brought to the campaign. He studied them throughout the war. He came to understand their command structure, their supply lines, their patterns of advance and retreat, and the cultural rules that shaped their behavior on and off the battlefield. This knowledge was not simply interesting to him. He used it to design battles that placed the Mandalorian forces at specific disadvantages, targeting their habits and expectations as much as their numbers. He knew when they would push forward and when they would hold ground. He knew which kinds of challenges they would meet with full aggression and which would cause hesitation. He also knew how to hit them where it hurt most deeply. The Mandalorian clan system meant that individual victories carried meaning beyond their military value. Defeating a commander, taking a significant position, or dealing a serious loss to a prominent clan carried cultural weight that a simple focus on numbers would miss entirely. He understood that layer of the conflict and used it on purpose. His tactics became harder and harsher as the war continued, not through a sudden decision, but through a slow hardening that happens when someone fights a long war and keeps reaching the conclusion that doing more is necessary. He entered the Mandalorian conflict as a Jedi who believed in decisive action. By its midpoint, he was authorizing operations with staggering costs and justifying them as necessary for the overall outcome. The individuals who served under him trusted him. The Republic praised his results. The Jedi Council, watching from Coruscant, felt the darkness around the conflict growing with each passing month and held their concern. Mitra Surik remained one of his most trusted generals throughout this entire period. The novel presents the exile as someone with real and substantial ability, a Jedi he relied on not just because she was skilled, but because she understood his approach well enough to carry out his intentions without needing constant direction. She was working at a level that would mark her own place in history in the years following the war. What neither of them fully understood while fighting was how deeply the experience was changing them both, reshaping their connection to the Force and to the people around them in ways that would take years to fully understand. A pattern Revan had been tracking since the middle of the campaign began to sharpen during the final phases of the war. The Mandalorians had attacked with a level of organization and purpose that seemed too careful and too well targeted to be entirely their own idea. Their advance had focused on specific resources and avoided others in ways that pointed toward outside guidance, something above the clan structure that was shaping the campaign's direction from a distance. He noted these patterns carefully, gathering the pieces, but could not yet identify their source. The sense that the war was not entirely what it appeared had become something he carried with him into every decision he made. The war's end would bring that feeling into sharp focus in a way that he had not prepared for. The final part of the Mandalorian conflict centered on a direct confrontation with Mandalore the Ultimate, the supreme leader of the Mandalorian clans. Under Mandalorian tradition, this title was more than a military rank. It held cultural weight that organized the entire clan system, gave the warriors their shared identity, and made continued resistance both possible and meaningful. Defeating Mandalorian forces battle after battle was a partial solution at best. Removing Mandalore changed everything at once. The Old Republic, Revan, describes the Republic's chief commander defeating Mandalore the Ultimate in one-on-one combat, and this was not simply a military achievement, though it was undeniably that. In Mandalorian terms, a single combat victory over Mandalore was the kind of act that moved through the entire culture with lasting force. It showed, in terms the Mandalorians recognized and respected above all others, that the victor was stronger. He had not just won the battle, he had proven his superiority in the way Mandalorian tradition understood it best. After the victory, he went further. He took the Mask of Mandalore, the sacred item that gave the title its authority and provided its holder a direct connection to Mandalorian identity and traditions spanning generations. Then, rather than keep it or destroy it, he carried it to the icy world of Rekiad and hid it there. His reasoning was clear and fully planned. Without the mask, there could be no new Mandalore to step into the title. Without a Mandalore to bring the clans together, the clans could not regroup and restart. The surrender that followed was not just a military outcome. By his design, it was something the Mandalorians had no structural way to reverse. He had not simply beaten them in the field, he had removed the very tool they would need to begin again. The Mandalorians surrendered without conditions. The Battle of Malachor V brought the war to its official end, but it did so at a cost that left permanent marks on everyone who was present. Malachor V held a key position in the final campaign, and the battle there became the most damaging engagement of the entire conflict. It was at Malachor V that Meetra Surik activated a gravity-based superweapon of enormous power that used the planet's own gravitational field as a weapon. The device destroyed the Mandalorian fleet while also devastating significant portions of the Republic forces caught in the same radius. The results were not precise in any sense. The weapon did not separate enemies from allies, and what it produced was destruction on a scale that went far beyond anything conventional military action could justify or explain. The battle ended the war. It also destroyed Malachor V and left wounds in the Force that those connected to it could feel from enormous distances. The novel describes the event as something that scarred the Force itself, an act that left a mark not just in the physical world, but in the living energy connecting all things. For the Jedi who survived, the experience caused damage that went beyond physical injury. The Force connection that tied them to the living world had been struck by something immense, and some of them lost that connection entirely in the aftermath. The lasting harm of that battle, or the Jedi who had fought under Revan's leadership, would reshape the next chapter of the Order's history in ways that would not become fully clear for some time. The Republic had been saved, but the cost of that salvation could not be simply measured. With the war over, neither Revan nor his closest companion returned to Coruscant. They did not present themselves to the Republic Senate or to the Jedi Council. Instead, they turned towards the uncharted space at the edge of the galaxy, taking a force of ships with them and a purpose they did not share publicly with anyone. What drove them there was the threat he had been following during the final phase of the war, the growing sense that the Mandalorian campaign had been guided from somewhere outside the clan structure. He had enough pieces of the pattern to believe there was something worth finding out there, something that had used the Mandalorians as a tool and was still intact, still waiting, still dangerous. He was right. He just did not understand what he was walking into. He left behind a Republic grateful for its survival and a Jedi Order deeply troubled by what it had witnessed. He took his closest companion and the ships he commanded and moved into space that most people did not enter by choice. The war was over. What came next had no name yet. He returned from the uncharted edge of the galaxy, but he did not return as a Jedi Knight. Chapter 3: Darth Revan. The uncharted space at the galaxy's edge was not simply an empty region waiting to be mapped. It was a specific kind of darkness, a part of the galaxy where travel routes were unstable, navigation was difficult, and the absence of Republic structure meant that whatever had developed there had done so entirely without contact from the wider civilization. For a man with Revan's sharp mind and his growing uncertainty that something significant had been operating behind the Mandalorian Wars, this unknown entity was not a mystery to avoid. It was a problem that needed to be solved. He and his closest companion moved in with their fleet, following the threads gathered during the campaign. They were looking for the source of the outside influence on the Mandalorian campaign. They found it, and it was far worse than either of them had prepared for. The hidden Sith stronghold was unlike anything in Republic-aligned space. The old Republic Revan describes it as a place covered in constant electrical storms, where the sky itself was violent and the atmosphere carried a heaviness that had nothing to do with the weather. The Sith Empire that had built itself in secret had been hiding for a very long time, growing in strength and waiting for the right moment to move against a Republic it had never stopped viewing as an enemy worth destroying. At the center of that empire was the Sith Emperor. His name, as the wider galaxy would eventually come to know it, was Vitiate. The same novel provides important details for understanding what made him different from the Sith the Republic and the Jedi had faced in earlier conflicts. He was not simply a powerful dark side user who had risen through the standard Sith system of strength and betrayal. he was something older and far more dangerous. He had achieved a form of lasting life, holding himself together through a connection to the dark side that went far beyond normal Force use. To show his power and feed that immortality, he had drained the Force from his original home world, a planet called Nathema, consuming every living thing on it in a single act. What had once been a living world connected to the Force became an empty shell, stripped of everything that made life possible in a Force sense. Vitiate had done this on purpose and had survived it. He had been building his empire and planning his return to the galaxy for centuries. The Mandalorian Wars had been part of that plan, a deliberate move to weaken the Republic and the Jedi before the main invasion arrived. When the two Jedi walked into his territory thinking they were tracking down a threat, they were entering a trap that had been built long before either of them was born. The novel is direct about what the Sith ruler did to them. He was more powerful than either of them, and his ability to take control of other minds was not a simple Force trick, but something he had refined over a very long life and used with terrible precision. When the two Jedi confronted him, he overpowered their mental defenses and seized control of their minds, turning them into instruments of his will and sending them back towards the Republic as the leading force of a Sith invasion. His plan was for them to serve him directly, to use their knowledge of the Republic and their established reputations to prepare the galaxy for conquest. He sent them back to do exactly that work. What he underestimated was the strength of their wills. Both men had been shaped by years of war into something that even the Emperor's mental control cannot fully contain. Their sense of identity was strong enough, their purpose defined enough, that even under his influence, they found a way to push his instructions in a different direction. They blocked out the memories of their time at the Emperor's stronghold. They pushed aside knowledge of the Emperor's existence and his plans. In doing so, they created something the immortal ruler had not intended. Two independent Sith conquerors who answered to no one but themselves. They became Darth Revan and Darth Malak. Revan's longtime friend, who had gone to war alongside him as Alec, took the Sith name Darth Malak and fully committed himself to the conquest they had been sent back to carry out. The man Revan had trusted above all others was now his apprentice in darkness, bound to him by shared purpose and a shared fall. The Republic's greatest heroes had become its greatest threat. This change did not arrive instantly in the wider galaxy. The two Sith Lords did not return from the uncharted regions and announce themselves at once. They came back with their fleet and began building power in an organized way, drawing Republic military forces to their banner, using Revan's established reputation and military authority to bring in recruits. Soldiers and commanders who had served under him during the Mandalorian Wars and trusted his judgment were now being folded into something very different from a Republic campaign. They were becoming a Sith war machine. The book, alongside the KOTOR campaign guide, supports the account of how organized and step-by-step this process was. Darth Revan was not creating disorder, he was building an army with the same careful mind that had won the Mandalorian Wars, now turned towards the destruction rather than the protection of the Republic. He was cold, focused, and working from a plan he followed carefully. At the heart of that plan was the ancient weapons factory built by a long-dead species. The Darth Bane trilogy identifies this installation, known as the Starforge, as a massive orbiting factory built by the Rakata, an ancient species of Force users who had once controlled much of the galaxy. It was not a standard military base, but an artifact powered by darkside energy, a construction that could produce war material at a rate that normal production could not come close to matching. The fleet it produced carried something of that dark energy within it, making it a weapon in more than one sense. Darth Revan had found this installation during his time in the uncharted regions with his companion, and now it served as the foundation of his military power, producing ships and weapons faster than the Republic could counter. With that foundation in place, the war began. The Republic's reaction to learning that the man who had saved it was now trying to destroy it was the kind of shock that does not clear quickly. These were not unknown enemies emerging from distant and unknown space. These were people the Republic had celebrated, relied on, and in many cases trusted completely with their lives. The name that had meant safety for years now meant the opposite, and the commanders who had followed Darth Revan into this new war had made their decision with full knowledge of what it meant. For everyone else, the scale of the turn was almost too large to absorb. The Jedi Order found itself living with the direct result of its own earlier decisions. The young commander had gone to fight the Mandalorian Wars against the Council's wishes, and now what he had become in that war was marching on the Republic the Jedi existed to protect. The Council had sensed a darkness tied to the conflict from the beginning. They had been right that something was wrong. They had not been able to stop what came from it. Darth Revan's campaign against the Republic was organized rather than simply destructive. He was not trying to burn everything. He was trying to conquer and control. He used the ancient factory's production capacity to maintain a fleet the Republic struggled to match. And he used his deep knowledge of Republic military practices and defensive positions to strike where the defenses were weakest. He was focused and effective, and the war he was fighting was not a balanced conflict. One side held major advantages, and that side was his. His approach to Force users reflected the same useful logic. He understood the value of Force-sensitive soldiers on his side, and some Jedi fell to the dark side during the war while others were captured and turned. The conflict added capable dark side warriors to his forces at a steady pace, building on what the ancient factory was already providing in military equipment and ships. Malak fought beside him, committed and effective throughout this period. Their relationship during the war was clearly defined. Darth Revan was the master, his former friend the student and subordinate. The former companion was powerful and capable, but he operated within the structure the Dark Lord had set. There was no visible sign of what was building inside him, no outward warning of what was coming. There rarely is until the moment arrives. What was developing beneath the surface in the subordinate's thinking was a growing ambition that the Dark Lord had not fully noticed. Malak was not satisfied with the role he had been given. He had watched his master operate at the highest level through both the Mandalorian Wars and the current conflict, and he had learned from every part of it. He had also been watching for a moment when the balance of power between them might shift in his favor, waiting for an opening that he could use. Meanwhile, the Jedi were not simply absorbing the damage, they were working on a response, and that response would come in a form neither Sith Lord fully expected. Malak turned on his master in the middle of battle, and in doing so, changed the direction of galactic history. Chapter 4: Betrayal. Being turned on by someone trusted completely is not simply a setback in battle. It is a break in the structure of everything a person has built their understanding of the world on. For the Dark Lord, who had organized the entire war around his own vision and turned the greatest military effort of his era towards a goal shaped entirely by his own will, his former companion's move against him was exactly that kind of break, and it came at a moment when there was no time to process it. During a battle with a Jedi strike team, Malak made his move. He ordered his own ships to open fire on his master's flagship, and while the strike did not kill the Dark Lord outright, it was damaging enough to destroy his physical state and leave him open in a way that the Jedi boarding party could use. The strike team, led by a Jedi named Bastila Shan, found him alive, but barely so. What the Jedi Council chose to do next was one of the most important and most troubling decisions made in this entire era. They chose not to let him die. They chose something far more complicated. Chapter 5: Memory Wiped. Bastila Shan was not a standard Jedi warrior. She possessed a rare force ability called Battle Meditation, which allowed her to support the focus and coordination of allied forces across large distances while at the same time weakening the drive and effectiveness of enemy units. A power that had been one of the key reasons the Republic had survived the war to that point. She had also, in the moments after the Dark Lord was struck down and before he was entirely lost, formed a shared force connection with him, something that was not planned and that carried effects no one had fully anticipated. That unplanned connection kept him alive when he should have died. In the critical moments after Malak's strike, Bastila reached out through it, using a telepathic stasis link to project life-saving energy into Revan even as he was falling, holding his life together long enough for the boarding party to bring him in. Without that intervention, the Jedi Civil War would have ended differently, and not in the Republic's favor. When the Council received him, they faced a choice that had no clean answer. Executing him was the simplest path. A Sith Lord in their custody, responsible for a war that had killed thousands, could have been put down and the matter closed. Some within the Order may have argued exactly that. The man they held was the most dangerous enemy the Republic had faced in generations. A Sith Lord who had built an invasion and came close to destroying everything the Republic was. He was also, through Bastilla's Force connection, linked to one of the Order's most valuable assets, and he was potentially the only person with enough knowledge of his own campaign to help end it. The Order's leaders chose a riskier path. Rather than execute him as the Sith Lord he was, they decided to wipe his memory completely, removing everything that made him Darth Revan and rebuilding his identity from the ground up. It was not a clean solution, it was a gamble, and everyone in that room knew it. The Old Republic Revan is honest about how unusual this decision was. Removing a person's memories is not a standard Jedi operation, and it raises serious questions about consent, identity, and the ethics of using another person as a tool. The Council justified it on the grounds of necessity. The war was still ongoing. The ancient weapons factory was still producing the fleet that threatened the Republic. The former Dark Lord, even as a prisoner, remained dangerous if his Sith identity stayed intact. Redirected, however, he could become the key to finding and destroying the factory that powered his former army. They built a false identity around a new purpose. The person who came out of the Council's work was not Darth Revan. He was a Republic soldier with no memory of who he had been, given a new background and a new set of apparent experiences that felt real because they had been placed directly into his mind. He did not know he was the Sith Lord who had led the war. He did not remember the Mandalorian Wars as their top commander. He did not remember Dromund Kaas or Vitiate, or the choice he and his former companion had made to become the enemy of everything they had once protected. He was, from all outward appearances, an ordinary person who happened to be connected to the Force. This rebuilt identity was placed aboard the Endar Spire, a Republic vessel sent as part of the continuing effort against the forces Malak now commanded. The plan was to put him near the search for the ancient weapons factory through the young Force-ability Jedi, whose shared connection with him was believed to carry traces of his buried knowledge that could be carefully guided, drawing out what was needed without triggering the memories the Council had buried. What no one was fully prepared for was how those memories would begin to surface on their own. The Force has a way of returning people to what they are, not all at once, but in pieces. Bastila Shan was still present throughout this period as his companion, and the bond between them was not simply a mission resource, but something the novel treats as genuine and real. It complicated both their positions in ways neither of them had been prepared for. She had been given instructions to treat her companion as a tool to be used against his former ally. The reality of spending time with him, of experiencing through their shared Force connection what he was actually like, was far more complicated than those instructions allowed for. For his part, certain things came to him with unusual ease. Strategy, combat, the ability to read situations and people quickly. These were not simply natural talents rising from nowhere, they were the marks of who he had truly been, coming through the buried memories and fragments and impressions he did not fully understand but could act on. He adjusted quickly to every situation he encountered. He formed real connections with the people around him. He made decisions that were, when examined later, entirely consistent with both his light side values and his practical, sharp thinking. He was moving back towards himself without knowing that was what was happening. Throughout this period, the war continued with Malak as its new leader. The former companion, now the unchallenged ruler of the Sith forces, pressed the campaign with a version of his master's original strategy, but with less precision and more destruction. He lacked the Dark Lord's discipline and focus. His campaign was effective in terms of raw power, but burned more than it needed to, and the Republic was still under enormous pressure as a result. Bastilla's capture by the new Sith ruler was one of the most damaging developments of this phase of the war. Malak understood the value of her Force ability and worked to break her. He had some success. She was pushed towards the dark side while in his hands, a process that her own doubts and internal pressures made possible in ways that a more settled Jedi might have resisted more completely. She was not simply overpowered, she had real internal struggles that he was able to work with and exploit, and the experience damaged her in ways that would matter greatly when the final confrontation arrived. For a man carrying a false identity, her capture was both a mission priority and something more personal that the Force connection between them made impossible to completely set aside. He had to find her, he had to stop the former companion, and he was, by this point, getting closer to understanding who he actually was and what had truly happened to him. Then, the full truth of his identity came back to him. The discovery that the person the Republic had sent to fight Darth Revan was Darth Revan landed with a weight that the careful construction of the memory removal could not fully absorb. He had been getting through fragments of the old memories throughout the search, pieces that arrived without context and without the full picture. But the complete knowledge, the clear and full understanding of what he had been and what he had done was something different from those fragments. It required him to decide, directly and without the opinion of delay, who he was going to be now that he knew the truth. The Council's gamble that removing his Sith identity would leave behind a person capable of choosing differently was about to be tested in the most direct way possible. Chapter 6: Starforge. The moment of full truth was not, by the account that the Old Republic Revan preserves, a moment of collapse or breakdown. He did not fall apart when the complete picture of his past became clear. He took it in, sat with it, and processed the knowledge that the Sith Lord he had been sent to stop was him, that the destruction of the war was the result of decisions he had made, and that the identity the Council had placed in his mind was a built replacement for something they had been afraid to leave intact. What he did with that knowledge said more about who he truly was than anything that had come before it. He chose the light side. This is the accepted outcome within Legends continuity, and the novel treats it not as a simple or easy choice, but as an act that required real effort and real commitment. The memories of Darth Revan were not sealed away forever, they were returning. The dark side way of thinking he had held, the belief in power as an end in itself, the willingness to use people as instruments, the acceptance that force was the answer to any problem, was not simply gone from him. It was something he had to look at directly and decide to walk away from, knowing it was there and choosing something else over it. What he found when he looked at who he had been was not someone he wanted to become again. The positive emotions he had always believed in, love, loyalty, the desire to protect those he cared about, the things the traditional Jedi Code treated as dangers to be managed, turned out to be exactly what the novel says they were, the foundation that gave him something real to return to. He had people he genuinely cared about. He had Bastila, who had been pushed towards the dark side and needed to be reached. He had a sense that the Republic he had fought to protect in the Mandalorian Wars was worth protecting again, even knowing what he had done to it. These were not abstract ideas, they were the specific and personal content of his choice. He also had work to do immediately. Bastila had been pushed towards the dark side while in the former companion's hands, and she was now at the ancient weapons factory, using her unique force ability for the enemy that she had once opposed. Getting to her and getting through her was the immediate problem standing between him and the war's end. The ancient factory itself was not simply a military base. As the Darth Bane series records from the knowledge store Revan would later leave behind, the Rakata construction was powered by dark side energy and drew on that energy to fuel its endless production. Being inside it, surrounded by that dark force, was not a neutral experience. It pushed whatever the person brought to it in a stronger direction. For someone already tipping towards darkness, it was a force towards worse. For someone committed to the light, it was a constant and exhausting test of that commitment. The assault on the facility required coordination between the forces fighting alongside him and the Republic fleet in the space above the planet. The former companion's war machine was still active and defending the installation, and the battle in space was a necessary condition for getting inside and reaching what waited there. The Republic, worn down but still fighting, provided that outer battle while the redeemed warrior moved through the factory itself. Instead, he found Bastila. The encounter with the young Jedi was not a straightforward fight. She had turned, but not completely, and the force connection between them was still present and real, something that cannot simply be switched off by what had been done to her. He understood that what she needed was not to be defeated in combat. Bastila confronted him directly, pleading with him to come back to the light, her lightsaber drawn and ready if he refused to listen. She was prepared to fight him if that was what it took. He did not make her. Standing at the center of the ancient factory, surrounded by the same dark energy that had once helped him turn into Darth Revan, he chose the light side anyway. The person she had reached through the force connection during the war, the person she had come to know beneath the false identity the Council had built, was still there and chose to stay. The novel indicates that he succeeded. Her return from the dark side was not a simple reversal or a quick fix. It required her to make the same kind of choice he had just made, to hold on to what she actually valued, rather than surrender to what the dark side was offering her. She had been pushed towards it by real internal struggles and real fears, and coming back from it was not painless or clean, but she came back. With Bastila returned to herself, the path to the former companion was open. Malak was waiting. He'd always known this confrontation would come, because he had made it certain the moment he ordered the strike on his master's flagship. What he had not fully considered was which version of his old master would arrive to face him. The man who had turned against the one he served expected to meet the darkness he knew and had once followed. What he found instead was something he was far less prepared for. The redeemed warrior had to earn his victory. The fight drew on everything Revan was. His combat ability developed over years of war and conflict. His sharp thinking, which even in single combat gave him a way of reading an opponent several moves ahead. His connection to the light side, which the dark energy saturated environment of the ancient factory was constantly pressing against. And his will, the same quality that had allowed both him and his former companion to resist the Sith Emperor's complete control years before at the Emperor's stronghold, now holding him firmly to the choice he had made. Malak fell. The ancient weapons factory, without its main defender and with the Republic fleet pressing the outer battle, was destroyed. The Sith war machine that had pushed the Republic to the edge of destruction broke apart. The war was not fully over in that single moment, since the remaining forces would take time to deal with, but the decisive blow had been struck. The threat that had defined the entire conflict was gone. The redeemed warrior was awarded the Republic's highest military honor in a ceremony that recognized what he had accomplished. The man who had been the Republic's greatest enemy had become, in the end, its savior. The Jedi Council, which had gambled the galaxy on the decision to remove his Sith memories and redirect him as a weapon against his former companion, had its gamble pay off. It was not a clean or straightforward victory. Too much had been lost, too many lives spent on both sides of the war, for celebration to come without weight. But the Republic survived. Bastila survived. The redeemed warrior survived. Even restored to the light, he knew the real Sith threat still waited in the uncharted regions of the galaxy. His full memories were returning now, not just the built identity the Council had placed in his mind, and not just the fragments that had surfaced during the mission. The deeper memories, the one that went back to Dromund Kaas, and the confrontation with the immortal Sith ruler, were coming back with full force. He remembered the Emperor. He remembered what had been done to him and his former companion. He remembered with growing and undeniable clarity that the hidden Sith Empire had not been destroyed when Malak died. It was still out there. Vitiate was still out there. The war the galaxy had just celebrated ending was not the real war. It was a first move, an opening play, and the Republic had survived it through a combination of effort and something close to luck. The actual invasion was still being planned, still being held back by whatever timing Vitiate was working from. The redeemed Jedi was one of the very few people alive who understood this fully, and that knowledge would not let him rest. He chose not to ignore what he knew. Chapter 7: Prison of Vitiate. 2 years after his redemption, the man who had once been Darth Revan was living on Coruscant with Bastila Shan, the young Jedi whose shared Force connection had kept him alive after Malak's strike and who had found her way back from the dark side inside the ancient factory. They had married, an act that reflected both the depth of what existed between them and his long-held belief that love was not the enemy the traditional Jedi teaching made it out to be. They had a son, Vaynor Shan. On the surface, it looked like the life of a man who had survived something terrible and found his way to something worth protecting. Underneath that surface, something was wrong. The old Republic Revan is clear and direct about this. He was haunted by visions of a storm coming, images he cannot fully explain or dismiss as ordinary anxiety or leftover damage from years of combat. They were, in the way Force visions sometimes are, true in a way the waking mind struggles to carry without acting on them. The storm he was seeing in those visions was real. It was the Sith Empire, still building in the uncharted regions, still waiting, still a threat that he alone among the people around him fully understood in its real dimensions. Those visions would not let him rest. Eventually, they drove him to act. The first step came from the Mask of Mandalore. During the war against the Mandalorians, Revan had hidden it on the icy world of Rekiad to keep the clans from coming together under a new leader. That had been a useful long-term move. Now, living on Coruscant 2 years after the war's end, pieces of memory from his time on Dromund Kaas were pulling at him, and the mask had become part of the thread he needed to pull to restore what was still missing from his understanding of events. He recruited Canderous Ordo, the Mandalorian warrior who had been part of his crew during the hunt for the ancient factory, for a journey to Rekiad to recover the mask. The old Mandalorian soldier had his own reasons for wanting it. Without a Mandalore to lead them, the clans had been broken and without clear direction since the war's end. Revan's purpose was different. He needed the mask to restore the memories that were still incomplete, to fill in the remaining gaps in what he understood about the outside influence that had pushed the Mandalorian clans to begin their assault on the Republic in the first place. They found the mask on Rekiad, and the recovery went as Revan had planned. Holding the mask again and putting it on restored the full memory of how the Sith Emperor had arranged for the Mandalorian clans to begin their assault on the Republic. The Mandalorian Wars had not simply happened as an independent event, they had been designed. The immortal Sith ruler had used the clans as a tool to weaken the Republic and the Jedi Order before his real attack could begin. And now, Revan had back the full picture of why he had been sent to fight a war that was itself a trap laid for him. The truth behind the Mandalorian Wars was darker than anyone in the Republic knew. His next step was the one that would cost him 3 centuries. He traveled to the Emperor's hidden stronghold in the Uncharted regions to look directly at the Empire he knew was still growing in secret. He went with T3M4, the navigation and repair droid that had been part of his crew during the search for the ancient factory and that carried encoded messages meant to reach Bastilla and the Jedi if he did not return from this journey. He also, as events developed, ended up working alongside Mitra Surik, who had been one of his most trusted generals during the Mandalorian Wars, and who had her own deep and unresolved history with that conflict and its aftermath. There, he was captured. The one who took him was Darth Nihris, a member of the Emperor's inner Sith ruling council. She did not kill him. She held him in a dungeon beneath her compound in conditions carefully designed to cut off his ability to use the Force. The novel describes his time there as 3 years of captivity, during which he was kept under the effect of drugs meant to block his Force connection, kept isolated, kept disoriented, held in a state where his abilities could not help him or protect him. 3 years in a Sith dungeon changes a person in ways that are hard to fully describe. But the former top military commander had something that his captor had seriously underestimated. His will was not something that chemicals in isolation could wear down to nothing. He was the same person who had resisted the mental control of the Sith Emperor well enough to push the Emperor's instructions in a different direction and act on his own. He was the same person who had come back from the dark side when most people who traveled as far as he had never returned. Even in captivity, he held on to himself and waited for a chance that might never come. Mitra Surik was the one who found him. The exile had returned from her own period away from the Order, the years that the aftermath of the war had cost her, and she had tracked the situation to the Emperor's stronghold through a combination of determination and Force sensitivity that made her one of the very few people capable of operating safely in that environment. She did not come alone. She came with an ally that the prisoner would not have chosen if given the option, a Sith Lord named Scourge. Lord Scourge was a member of the Sith Order with his own reasons for involvement in the situation. He was not acting from belief in the Republic or any loyalty to the Jedi. He was someone who had looked at the political situation of the Stronghold and concluded that helping to free Revan served his own interests better than the alternatives available to him. His cooperation was real and functionally useful. His reasons were entirely about his own survival and advancement. That combination made him a valuable partner in the short term and a deeply unpredictable one in any larger sense. When the exile and the Sith Lord reached the dungeon and freed the prisoner, the return of his full self was immediate and powerful. The novel describes him putting on his old mask, the red and gray helmet that had become the image history connected to his name, and feeling his complete memory and strength come back at once. He had been reduced for 3 years. When the mask went back on, he was himself again, and he declared himself Revan Reborn. His first act after that declaration was to destroy Darth Nihris. Turning her own dark side lightning back against her with full control and full force, he ended his captor immediately. She had subjected him to 3 years of imprisonment and had been a significant figure in the Sith structure he needed to take apart. He used her own weapon against her as his answer to what she had done. With that done, the 3 of them settled on their next move. The goal was the most direct possible solution: kill the Emperor. Vitiate was the source of the threat that the former top military commander had spent years trying to address. The architect of the Mandalorian Wars, the origin of what had been done to him and Malak, and the force behind an invasion the Republic had no idea was still coming. Removing him was the only answer that actually solved the problem at its root rather than at its edges. They moved on the Emperor together. The attempt was not a desperate or poorly planned move. Revan was at full strength. The exile had a unique relationship with the Force that made her dangerous in ways the Sith ruler might not have expected, and the Sith Lord's knowledge of the internal structure of the stronghold gave them access they would otherwise never have been able to reach. Then, Scourge turned against them. The details the novel provides for this are specific and deeply uncomfortable. During the approach to the Emperor, the Sith Lord experienced a vision. He saw that the attempt to kill the immortal ruler would fail, that neither the exile nor the redeemed warrior would be the one to eventually bring Vitiate down. He saw a future warrior, someone neither of them was, who would one day be the agent of the Emperor's destruction. Scourge made a calculation. Surviving to wait for that future person was worth more than dying in an attempt that his vision told him would not succeed. He told the Emperor what was coming. Mitra Surik was killed, Revan was captured, and placed in stasis. The Sith Lord's reasoning was not without its own cold logic. He had seen something real, and had acted to protect himself based on it. But the cost of that calculation fell entirely on the people he had come there with. The exile, who had survived the Mandalorian Wars, and her years of exile and the long journey to Dromund Kaas, died because of a decision she had no knowledge of and no chance to prepare for. Revan, who had already lost 3 years to Nyrus' dungeon, lost centuries to what came next. The Sith ruler placed him in stasis and began drawing on his Force energy, using the connection between them to feed his own power across generations. But even inside that prison, the captured warrior was not passive. This is perhaps the most important element of the story that the novel preserves. The Emperor's connection to Revan, the link that allowed Vitiate to draw on his strength, ran in both directions. Revan used it. He could not escape through it. He could not overpower the immortal ruler from the inside of a stasis chamber, but he could influence. He worked on the Emperor's fears, amplifying them, feeding the ruler caution and hesitation, turning Vitiate's concerns about failure and exposure into something more intense and more paralyzing than they would otherwise have been. The effect was that the invasion the Emperor had been building towards for centuries was pushed back in its timing, not stopped, but delayed in ways that gave the Republic more time, more chances, more opportunities to be in a better position to survive what was eventually coming. Revan did this for Bastilla, for Vaynor, for the family that Vitiate's stasis had taken him away from. He could not go back to them on Coruscant, but he could protect them from inside the prison that kept him from them, and he chose to spend centuries doing exactly that. After 300 years, he would eventually break free, but he would not emerge whole. Chapter 8: Legacy. Centuries of stasis inside a Sith Emperor's prison do not leave a person whole. The Revan who eventually appeared in the events of the Star Wars The Old Republic storyline was not the same clear and unified figure who had fought the Mandalorian Wars or challenged Vitiate directly at the Emperor's stronghold. The dark side energy that the stasis had maintained, drawing on his strength for 300 years, had left marks that went deep into his sense of self. His light and dark aspects had been separated, divided into something that worked almost like two expressions of the same person, each carrying part of what he had been, and neither carrying all of it. This division is the defining feature of the Revan encountered in the Old Republic game and its expanded storylines. He was not simply a hero working his way free of a long imprisonment. He was a figure whose internal conflict had been made real and external by what Vitiate had done to him across centuries. The light that had driven his return to the Jedi and his quiet resistance from inside the stasis was real and present. The darkness that had made him Darth Revan, that had organized the Sith war machine and prosecuted the war against the Republic, was also real and present. Neither aspect resolved cleanly into the other, and in some ways, they did not fully come together again. The divided figure was both more dangerous and more open to harm than either half alone. One of the most visible effects of his legacy during during this era was the emergence of the Revanites, a secret group within the Sith Empire that organized itself around his teachings and held his name around their identity. The movement was built on genuine respect for what the former Sith Lord represented, but its understanding of him was necessarily limited by what its members actually had access to. They had the outline of his story and the broad points of his philosophy. What they did not have was the full context that gave those positions their actual meaning and weight. The result was a movement that carried his name without being able to fully capture what had made him who he was. The Revanites believed that their founding figure stood above the simple line between Jedi and Sith, that his willingness to draw on both sides of the Force made him a model for something beyond the standard categories. There was truth in that belief. He had genuinely held positions that did not fit neatly into either tradition, but the movement that carried his name simplified that complexity in ways that he would not have recognized as accurate or complete. The confrontation that came on Yavin 4 was the endpoint of this arc. The events that brought the divided figure to Yavin 4 are drawn from the game's expanded storylines, and the shape of the conflict there reflects the central tension that had defined him since the stasis. Whether the dark or light parts of someone who had been both a Jedi and a Sith Lord could come back together, or whether one eventually had to take over. On Yavin 4, that question reached its final answer, the release of his spirit, the moment the storyline presents as the resolution of everything his imprisonment had torn apart was not a defeat. It was, in the way the Force sometimes works in Legends continuity, a completion. The man who had been fighting in one form or another since before the Mandalorian Wars finally stopped fighting. He did not give in to darkness. He did not become something lesser than what he had been. He passed through the end of his physical life into whatever the Force held on the other side of that passage, and the centuries of built-up conflict passed with him. What remained was his legacy, and that legacy was wide enough to shape the galaxy for thousands of years after his death. The mark he left on Sith philosophy was as significant as anything he did in battle. The novel series provides the clearest record of this. The former Sith Lord had left a knowledge-storing Force crystal known as a holocron on the planet Leon, the unknown world where the final battle of the war against the Republic had been fought. That stored record sat on Leon for roughly 3,000 years before the Sith Lord Darth Bane discovered it. What the future Sith Reformer found inside became the foundation for one of the most significant changes in the history of the Sith Order. The stored teachings argue that any Sith Master who trained more than one student at a time was making a serious mistake. The reasoning was direct and grounded in observation. Multiple students would eventually come together against their master. This was not a distant theoretical risk. It was the natural result of a system that selected ambition and rewarded the willingness to remove those who stood in the way. The former Sith Lord had understood this and put it down clearly enough that Darth Bane, reading it 3,000 years after the physical death of its author, found it entirely convincing. That argument became the one master, one apprentice rule that the future Reformer applied to the entire Sith Order. He reduced it from a large and constantly fighting organization to a single pair at any given time. One master and one apprentice, passing power and knowledge forward through direct succession rather than through open competition. This structure was the model that carried the Sith forward into the era of Darth Sidious and the Galactic Empire. It was the rule that produced Darth Vader. It came through a direct line from thinking done by a man who had lived 3,000 years before it was applied. The man who helped save the Republic also provided the ideas that eventually led to its destruction. The Darth Bane series also records another layer of what the stored teachings contained that makes Revan's contribution to Sith history even more significant. He had understood what the series calls the inescapable reality of the Sith, that their own ambition and internal fighting would always lead to their defeat by a united Jedi Order. This was not a pessimistic view, but a clear-eyed analysis of a pattern he had seen play out repeatedly. The Sith, left to their natural ways, would always destroy themselves from the inside before outside enemies could. What made his knowledge store so valuable to Darth Bane was not just the one master, one apprentice rule. It was the understanding of why that rule was the only way the Sith could survive long enough to eventually win. Revan had seen the inescapable problem clearly and had worked out the solution. He had also authored a written volume titled The Rakata and the Unknown World, preserving his knowledge of the ancient species and their factory for those who came after him. Beyond the stored knowledge record, the other philosophical content the series records shows the full full range of what the former Sith Lord had developed during his time as Darth Revan. His teachings said that the dark side offers more power as an end in itself, that one must take hold of it without holding back, and that mercy, compassion, and loyalty are ideas that stop a person from reaching their full potential. The Sith must be led by a single strong figure, and if that figure grows weak, they must be replaced by someone stronger. One of the most remembered sayings from the stored record was that honor is a fool's prize, and glory is of no use to the dead. Another was that through victory, chains are broken. These were the teachings of Darth Revan, the dark side version of a man who had also believed in protecting people and in the real strength of positive emotion. These two positions are not entirely opposite. They're the product of someone who understood power deeply and from both sides, who had lived the full range of what the Force could lead a person towards. The stored knowledge preserved the dark side version of that understanding. The light side version had played out in his choices at the ancient factory and in the stasis chamber, in the way he spent centuries quietly delaying an invasion to protect the family he can no longer reach. Both versions shaped what came after him. His descendants carried his legacy into the future in ways he could not have imagined when he was living on Coruscant with Bastilla and Vaynor. The narrative traces the line from Revan and Bastilla through their son Vaynor Shan, the child the imprisoned warrior had worked for centuries to protect, forward through generations to two figures who shaped the Old Republic era in their own right. Theron Shan, the former Sith Lord's descendant and the son of Grand Master Satele Shan and Republic Supreme Military Leader Jace Malcolm, was not sensitive to the Force. He was, however, a senior field agent for the Republic's intelligence service, described in the novel as highly intelligent, quick to adapt, and deeply practical in his approach to impossible situations. The same qualities that had defined Revan's approach to planning and action showed up, without the Force, in his descendant's career as a Republic spy, operating in the most dangerous circumstances the era produced. Theron's most notable mission, as recorded in the Old Republic Annihilation, was Operation Endgame, a mission he undertook alongside Master Nostaral, a Jedi Master who served as the Republic's top expert on the Sith and as the keeper of the Jedi archives. Nostaral had spent his career studying the Sith Empire, building the most complete picture available to the Republic of how the Empire operated, how it thought, and what it was planning. Together, the intelligence agent and the Jedi historian partnered to destroy the Ascendant Spear, a Sith prototype warship of exceptional power that represented a serious threat to the Republic's ability to defend itself. Their success in Operation Endgame was a direct result of the combination of Theron's field skills and Nostaral's deep knowledge of the enemy they were fighting. The presence of both these figures in the same era, shaped by these same institutions and the same ongoing conflict, was in its own way a continuation of what Revan had started. The Republic they were protecting was the same Republic he had fought to save thousands of years before. The Sith Empire they were working against was the same one that had captured and imprisoned him. His descendants were carrying forward the same fight in a later chapter of the same war. Satele Shan carried more than just Revan's blood. She carried the tension of his philosophy in her own life. The novel presents the Grand Master as a defining figure of the Jedi Order during this era, someone who led the Jedi through one of their most difficult periods, with a level of ability and commitment that earned her the respect of both Jedi and Republic military. She had defeated the Sith Lord Darth Malgus at the Battle of Alderaan. She guided the Order through the Cold War and the return of the Sith Empire with a steady hand and a clear sense of purpose. She also lived by the Jedi teaching most directly connected to her ancestors' central disagreement with the Order. The same novel records that she followed the Jedi mantra strictly: there is no emotion, there is peace. She pushed aside the emotional connections that could have pulled her towards choices driven by personal feeling, rather than a Jedi's wider responsibility. The clearest example of this was her decision to give up her son Theron to be raised by her mentor, Master Ngani Zhou, rather than raise him herself. She feared that her love for the child could push her towards choices that served her personal feelings, rather than the people she was responsible for protecting. She followed the Jedi Code in that decision. She also felt the weight of it for the rest of her life. The echo of Revan and his descendants' experience is not simply interesting as a family story. It reflects something true about what his legacy meant in practice across generations. His argument that love and positive emotion could strengthen a Jedi rather than weaken them was not simply a position recorded in old texts and forgotten. It was something Satele lived with every day, not not as an abstract position, but as a real personal tension that shaped her relationships and her choices. His belief had been preserved and passed forward. What to do with it was still being worked out hundreds of years after his death. The Jedi Order as an institution was also permanently shaped by the destruction the war against the Republic had brought. After the war's end, the Order took specific steps in direct response to what had happened. The Darth Bane series notes that the Jedi officially banned the Sith and their teachings in the aftermath of the conflict and worked actively to remove all Sith teaching tools, including Force-stored knowledge records. The presence of Sith philosophy in a form that could be found and used was seen as too dangerous to allow, given what that philosophy had produced when Revan and Malak had encountered it and made it their own. The Order's response was to try to remove the tools that could repeat the process. This effort was not fully successful. The stored knowledge record left on Leon was still there, waiting for Darth Bane 3,000 years later. But the intention behind the effort reflected a real understanding of what the war had shown. That contact with the Sith way of thinking, especially for someone already inclined to question the traditional Jedi approach, was a genuine and lasting danger that the Order could not simply ignore. The Far Outer Territories, for their part, remembered the former Sith Lord differently from how the Republic's core worlds did. Among populations that had experienced both the Mandalorian Wars and the war that followed it, Revan was not simply a traitor or an enemy to be written out of history. He was also, for many of those people, the person who had shown up when the official defenders were not showing up. The storyline notes that some people on the Outer Territories remembered him as a figure who saved the Republic, rather than the threat that the core worlds tried to remove from history. That split view was honest because he had done both things, often for reasons that were connected to each other rather than desperate. His legend did not become simpler after his death. It became more layered and more contested. The Revanite movement, the knowledge record on Leon, the descendants who carried his blood and his tensions into later centuries, the changes to the Jedi Order, the one master, one apprentice rule that governed the Sith until Darth Sidious dismantled it thousands of years later. These were all effects of a life that had refused to be simple or easy to categorize at any point. He had been a Jedi who would not wait while people suffered. He had been a soldier who won a war and lost himself in the process of winning it. He had been a Sith Lord who was still, underneath the years of dark side influence and the Emperor's control, something that the dark side cannot fully contain or permanently claim. He had been a prisoner who fought a battle no one knew about for 300 years. He had also been a husband and a father living on Coruscant, haunted by visions, who walked back into danger 2 years after his redemption because he cannot make peace with leaving it unaddressed. He never got to know whether Bastilla and Vaynor were safe after he was taken. He spent 3 centuries working towards that outcome from inside a stasis chamber through a mental connection to the man who had imprisoned him, with no way of knowing if any of it was enough. The 5 words the novel uses to describe him, as hero, traitor, conqueror, villain, savior, are all accurate in the sense that each one describes something real about what he was at different points across his life. But none of them individually captures the most important thing, which is that the line between all 6 of them was much thinner than it appeared from the outside, and that the same qualities that made him capable of becoming each of those things was present in him at the same time. His brilliance was not separate from his danger. His love was not separate from his willingness to make choices that caused enormous harm. His return to the light did not erase what came before it. It simply added another chapter to a story that was never going to have a clean ending. The Jedi Council had been right to sense danger in the Mandalorian Wars. The young commander who defied them had been right that staying back while systems burned was a failure of the Order's most basic purpose. Both of those things were true at the same time, and the history of the Old Republic never fully settled which one mattered more. The people who studied his life kept arriving at different conclusions, and the ongoing disagreement is probably the most honest tribute that could be paid to a life that never settled those questions itself. Revan's legend does not end with his death. It becomes a model, a warning, and a symbol that the galaxy carries forward without fully understanding. Revan's life proves that the line between Jedi and Sith was never as clear as either side wanted to believe, and that the choices of one person made across a lifetime and then 3 centuries of silent resistance could reshape the galaxy in ways that outlasted every empire and every war he ever fought. In the age of the Old Republic, his story was only the beginning of a conflict far larger than any single legend. Revan's story sits at the center of a much longer history. The ancient Sith who shaped the dark side long before he was born, the warlords, the fallen Jedi, the philosophers who turned darkness into doctrine, are covered in full in the complete timeline of the ancient Sith already on this channel, and the rule of 2 that historic knowledge helped create did not end with Darth Bane. It produced a chain of masters and students stretching across 3,000 years, every one of them carrying a piece of what Revan had understood forward toward the final strike against the Republic. That complete Sith lineage, from Bane all the way to Sidious and Vader, is also waiting on this channel for those who want to follow the full line. If this documentary gave you the foundation, both of those are the next step.